President Biden is set to meet with Vladimir Putin over a Zoom call in just about 90 minutes or so. About 10:30 this morning, they're going to be meeting. And among the talking points that we already got sort of a preview of, first of all, why do they release this stuff ahead of time? Like the White House released ahead of time, they're like, here's what I'm going to tell him. So they floated out to the media ahead of actually what he's going to tell him.
Well, maybe because if he forgets or he doesn't say it properly, we know he had a good plan.
Yeah, right? But he just didn't articulate it enough. Well, because possible. No reporters are going to be in the room, right? Reporters won't be in the room. They won't be allowed to be in there to ask questions. So they're going to just have to rely on what we think we know about this. Anyway, so what he is expected to say is that we are going to have basically soul-crushing sanctions
from hell, he's been calling it.
Yeah, sanctions from hell. It's going to crush the Russian government and the Russian economy if you don't remove these troops from the Ukrainian border.
Now, meanwhile, Russia wants a promise from the United States that Ukraine will not join NATO like some of the other neighboring countries have. In 2004, some surrounding nations began to join NATO, and Vladimir Putin and the Russian government doesn't like it. They don't want this democratic creep. They feel like they do not need that at their borders. And he is asking for NATO leaders and specifically Joe Biden to commit to leaving Ukraine out. The president of the United States, Joe Biden, has says we do not accept red lines. That's not really for him to ask at all. We're going to do whatever the bleep we want. But if Russia continues to ask for these ultimatums, then we will respond in kind.
So what's the truth here in all of this? I mean, this is the question, right?
You just went, ugh.
Yeah. I'm like, where's Kennedy when you need him?
Yeah, we're going to go to war because we want to push an extension of this military-industrial complex. Make no mistake about it. Like think about NATO, right? Like we think it's a force for good, or at least that's the propaganda, right?
Yeah.
NATO is a force for good. When off the coast of the Iberian Peninsula, the force for good is constantly doing military exercises. They're constantly doing bombing runs and tests, and ships are getting together, and they're doing all sorts of big training and military exercises is NATO on a regular basis. And NATO is now going to expand in a post-World War II era its military presence by adding in an additional ally that only sets then to like keep Russia out, right? We're basically saying you can't be a part of this club. You can't be a part of this military club because we're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're watching you, China, and we're watching you, Russia.
Cryptologija in the chat says, can we get into that Zoom call? I mean, Russia has some of the best hackers.
Yeah.
Can you open a link to that, please?
Think about World War II when our efforts were more spent on building bases to intimidate Russia than liberating the Jews. Like that was our main focus, and we're still there. Like after World War II, we stayed, and we still have things pointing at Russia all along the border.
Right.
So we've been trying to intimidate them since then.
Right. I was thinking today, because today is Pearl Harbor Day. It's the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that served to unite the country around support about getting into the war, right? Mm-hmm. And back then, people took it from face value because there was a high trust of government that this happened, we now need to get involved, whereas before we didn't. And I thought about, what if that happened today? We would not have taken it at face value like that. Now we'd be like, whoa, is that really happening? Did this really, Well,
I guess we all even jumped in on this when we heard about the submarine that hit an object in the South China Sea a few months ago. Remember that? A nuclear submarine with the best technology in the world just hit a giant object.
Just like the Gulf of Tonkin.
Right. Like, what was that we hit? So now we need to have a bigger presence in the South China Sea just to make sure that we don't hit other objects. And now
we bumped an eel.
Right. Yeah. We hit a whale. That's what it was that caused that kind of damage. Anyway, I mean, I just want to unpack this Russia side of this equation, because in the West, we just don't get why they would want to put 175,000 troops along the border. Now, I'm not defending Russia. I'm just showing you that we don't hear this in the Western media at all. You're not going to see this on CNN. Mm-hmm. You're not going to see this on Fox. They are the bad guy.
Is you see
Russia
it on
is the bad
RT.
guy. Yeah, you'll see it on the Russia RT. I mean, because I think their whole motto is like "open your eyes," right, or question everything.
They cover it more than our own media. They're telling they're negatively talking about Russia on their own network.
So Russia wants to make sure that we have a pledge that NATO will stop expanding east towards Russia. They do not want the Western military alliance right at their doorstep, like right next door, literally building now, adding Ukraine into this massive military industrial complex.
But they also can't make decisions for their neighbors. They can want what they want, right? And we can hear them, but you don't decide what religion your neighbors are.
Only we can do that.
Right. We decide what religion our neighbors are.
So big question, though, are we going to war? And Aaron Mate, who's an excellent journalist, one of maybe the few real journalists out there, he has a show called Pushback, and he had a guest on, Richard Sakwa, who's a professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. He has a new book, out, not new, called Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands. And he has another new book out called Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War. And Aaron specifically asked him, hey, the Washington Post is saying, like, we're heading towards war here. Do you agree with that? You are certainly a clear-headed analyzer of all of this. What do you think? And here's what he had to say about that. Yes, here it is.
The former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and Alexei Honcharuk, a former Ukrainian prime minister under the current Ukrainian president Zelensky. They write this: since 1939, the specter of an all-out conventional war in Europe between two major militaries has never been greater. Would you agree with that?
I would, even though I don't agree how they got to that point in the argument. The actual substance is that I actually do think that we are closer to war. Well, certainly I don't know about 1939, but since 1945, in terms of a Cold War. I argue that indeed we are in a second Cold War, accompanied by propaganda, disinformation, the demonization of the opponent. Plus, of course, the militarization of Europe. We have a new Iron Curtain now, no longer from Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, but from all the way down to Mariupol in Ukraine. So yes, we are closer, and the language and the vitriol and the distrust, there's just no substantive basis for the powers, Russia, the United States and its European allies, to move beyond this impasse. And so, and of course, then we have a volatile situation, a front line in Ukraine, which could explode at any moment because, domestic politics, as always, even the first Cold War, often the tail wags the dog. Neither Russia nor the United States, of course, want conflict. But of course, but these things happen. We saw the sleepwalking into 1914, and we have military exercises. We have U.S. planes. I mean, I think that this one study showed that nearly 2,000 near military misses have taken place since 2014. One day, planes will collide, ships will collide, something will happen, and we're off.
And we're off.
Well, and think about it. Like, think about every negative thing that you hear that happens in the media. The elections, Hillary Clinton lost, all this other stuff. Why? Russia. Why does this happen? Russia. Like, think for how many years we have been hearing that Russia is the reason for all of our woes in this country.
Yeah, I remember back when I was anchoring the news in Fox, in Manhattan, we had on a New York NYPD detective, and he came on from their cyber crimes unit, and he said, everything we've got, it comes out of Russia. Everything we deal with comes out of Russia. Russia, over and over and over again.
The military-industrial complex has wanted Russia for, think of that. If it wasn't for Kennedy, we already would be there.
So he talked about misinformation on both sides, right? And so what do you think? I have no idea. I don't read Russian. What do you think is the Russian line against America right now? Well,
I think just look at what they're saying. On their face, they see NATO as a massive military industrial complex with multiple military allies on their doorstep, and they see it as a threat to their country. I think that's
not just to their way of being, but to their actual safety, you think?
Wouldn't we feel that way? I guess the question is, think about it in the reverse, right? Would we feel the same way? Would we feel the same way?
If there were troops on the Canadian border and the Canadian border was then converting to...
Yeah, we had 175,000 troops along the Canadian border that were ready to perhaps jump.
But that is the true use of our military. Our true use of our military is defend our own borders, right?
Right.
We wouldn't have to call in our allies to come help us do that. If we had our military here like it's supposed to be and not scattered out all over the world, we could defend our own borders. And that's the role of our military only. We're not supposed to be in all these other. It's unconstitutional for us to be over there.
Yeah, and it was amazing when we had all these troubles at home and we had to send the National Guard at the last minute because we didn't have enough domestic troops on the ready to deal with certain issues across the country.
They couldn't even stop Trump supporters from going in the Capitol building.
Right, because we didn't have the at-home domestic. But on the Russian side, I think he lays it out interestingly. I think he, as Richard Sakwa points out, there's all of this demonization of Russia and all of this misinformation about there being internal, like that somehow that Putin would need this war to coalesce his coalition at home, and nothing could be further from the truth. Like, he doesn't need this war. He doesn't need a war in Ukraine in order to consolidate power at home.
He already extended his term limits last year.
Right, but that's been floating around in Western media, this idea that he needs this to shore up power and
because
show
of the
strength.
Alexei Navalny imprisonment, do you think?
Even that. I mean, yes, you could even, like, rounding up dissidents, rounding up individuals. I mean, he's got that power. And it is certainly, this country is moving more towards authoritarianism. That is the line from the West. How true is it? If you're having if you're being told what you can and cannot say on television, you're having state media tweaked and removed, you're having officials who speak out against the government put in prison or hidden, then yeah. But as far as him needing to consolidate power by starting a war, makes no sense, doesn't make any sense. And I think it's just security. I think that's what, if you want to look at it on its face, I think that's what they're saying. That, hey, we don't want this. We don't want Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, which is an extension of the United States. And that's really what it is.
All the things you just mentioned, like, what really is different that's going on here?
What do you mean?
Yeah, you're right about that.
All the stuff you listed, the media, like, we're being censored more and more, and we can't have a voice and talk about certain things, and there's obviously things are being hidden from us. So it's like it's encroaching here. It's becoming authoritarian.
Francis brings up a great point in the chat. Says, I sort of agree with Clayton. America has the Monroe Doctrine for a region, and Russia has the right also, but Russia also wants Ukraine, which is not their right. So I guess invasion and annexing, like they did in the Crimea, et cetera, would not be favorable. And of course, we have mineral rights and we have oil rights and everything else that we think we have by folding Ukraine into NATO and then us having that country become part of our territory. We already send planes and drones and billions of dollars in money to the Ukrainian army. Like, all of those guns they have, where do you think they came from? As Richard Sakwa points out, we have sent them massive amounts of armament already, the Ukrainian government. So I don't know. It seems like we're getting closer and closer to war here, because if the White House is basically saying this is going to be NATO and Vladimir Putin is saying no way, then what else is next but war? But again, President Biden meeting with President Putin in about 90 minutes.
Right, but because you have that attitude, David, a lot of people don't, right? So Clayton asked the question earlier, why does the White House release talking points? Why are we getting this information, right? Because they want to rally us to support if there is, in fact, a war. And I think that there's a lot of reason to believe that the government does want war. And I think it's worth remembering that war affects us all disproportionately. And specifically now, I know you're not the biggest fan of Rachel Maddow, but in her first book about war, she makes the point that war is continually removed from us so that it does not hurt the average person. Why? Because the troops are taken from a lower socioeconomic population, right? So a lot of the sort of middle upper classes, they don't send their kids to war quite as often.
When you mean removed from, you mean kept at arm's length.
Like, it doesn't hurt us the way it once did. Like, everybody had a troop or a soldier in their family. A lot of people felt the loss of war, and it's sort of insulated now from certain classes.
Now it's only poor people.
Yeah. Exactly right. And so The lower classes are not insulated. They do send their kids to war a lot of times because they don't have other resources for education and career. But more privileged people do not. And so when it feels like, oh, there's going to be a war, that sucks, but nobody I know will be sent or die, it's easier to sort of sign off on the government's propaganda about needing war when it's a little bit more arm's distance from you. I mean, this is...
Yeah, it's kept
I don't
away.
mean to get theoretical, but this is what John Baudrillard warned about in The Gulf War Did Not Exist, is that wars now are these like postmodern, like it's sanctions, I don't know, you can't touch it, you can't see it, I'll just sort of get involved emotionally, but it doesn't hurt me very much. It does. And look at the inflation that we have, look at the budget, look at our economy. It does. Yeah,
and look at CNN, which makes billions of dollars, and all of these media corporations make so much money off of war. So they want it. Of course they want it. And they want to beat the drum of this.
It floored me that our drone program didn't slow down or anything during a pandemic. Like during the pandemic, we, if anything, increased our drone strikes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
We're going to talk about drones a little later, or we can talk about them now.
No, we'll talk about it in a second. Okay. Cryptologia sent in a $4 super chat. Thank you so much. Says, I'm originally from Serbia, and I was 14 when the Force for Good that stand united in NATO bombed Serbia, destroying hospitals, schools, TV stations. Yeah, that Force for Good, exactly. The Force for Good in NATO. It's coming for you. So Jen Psaki was asked really quickly here about what we can expect. Should Americans prepare for war? And here's what she had to say.
A range of topics in the U.S. and Russia relationship, including strategic stability, cyber, and regional issues. But you can certainly expect that our concerns about the military activities on the border will be a prominent part of the discussion. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Should Americans be prepared for the likelihood to see American forces on the ground in the region in the event that Russia does invade?
I'm not going to get ahead of the president's conversations with his transatlantic partners, which is going to happen later this afternoon, and we'll provide you a list of who will be participating in that call as soon as those scheduling details are finalized. But I would say that our objective here, Cecilia, is conveying diplomatically that this is the moment for Russia to pull back their military buildup at the border, that diplomacy is the right path forward here, but that we are going to continue to coordinate closely with our partners, our transatlantic partners, on a range of economic sanctions and steps that couldn't be taken should President Putin decide to move forward.
So
what was all that? Just
big word salad, but
right.
But at the end of the day,
all we ever get from them.
Yeah, we get these word salads, but no, I mean, would it not have been encouraging to have the press secretary of the White House say, absolutely not. There's nothing that the president wants less than to have American soldiers on the boots on the ground inside the Ukraine. Are you kidding me?
In the winter?
Like we're going to start
Omicron?
But it's like, she's like, I'm not going to get ahead of what the president talks about on a Zoom call today, but
we're going to wait and see on that.
We're going to wait and see. So it could be a possibility. So again, we'll have an update for you tomorrow on the show. We'll be watching it closely, but we already got a preview of what he's telling him, which is, look, you get these troops out of here, Mr. Putin, or we are going to have soul-crushing sanctions on your country. Get these troops back home. And to which Putin's going to say, okay, I call your bluff.
We would like to cover it live, but we remind you it is a private Zoom call, and we were not given the link, so we will have to report to you tomorrow. And otherwise, we'd stay on like the Blue Ocean or whatever launch.
Yeah. We, unfortunately, too, we have a military-industrial complex that, like no president since Kennedy has stood up against, so that cooler heads prevail. Make no mistake that the military-industrial complex wants this war worse more than anything. So you're going to see, like, if you just pay attention to what they're actually saying, and her vagueness is by design. She's being vague because, they don't want this. Like maybe Biden himself personally doesn't want it, but like, look what happened to Kennedy when he fought anything that they wanted to do, Yeah. So it's like this wheel is turning, and there's not anyone who can stop it.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, she's going to be vague because she doesn't want to be held to something.